So we're nearly at the end of Interact, so congratulations for staying the distance, and I'm extremely pleased and honoured to welcome our closing keynote, not only because he swapped and became the closing keynote, but I think it's very fitting that we have a closing keynote with Jonathan's expertise, because our theme is design for equality and justice, and Jonathan represents both aspects of those themes. So he's a worldwide famous accessibility researcher with many books, many publications. I always look at my publication list and then Jonathan's publication list and think, oh, I might as well give up.
No, don't say that. No.
But he's also a qualified lawyer, which I actually only learned recently and I find really interesting. And for young researchers, I think that's really interesting to think about how to combine what you're passionate about and a technical skill or something that can be a career. If you can find something you're passionate about and use it in your career. So I assume Jonathan likes the law.
Well, I went back as a graduate student for another degree because I needed to learn more about accessibility in law, so yeah.
But at the moment, Jonathan is professor at the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland, but he's also, most importantly, executive director of the fairly new, I believe, Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility. So thank you very much for coming all the way to talk to us, and thank you for being our closing keynote. So over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Helen, for the kind words. Good afternoon, everyone. Come on, let's try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. Hey, there you go. It's the end of the conference, so we want to make sure that we're keeping the energy up. And apparently there's cake waiting for us, so I will try not to be between you and cake. I'm excited to talk to you today about the born accessible model of software and digital content development. And I'm passionate about accessibility, as Helen mentioned. Helen also mentioned I had gone back mid-career to study law. Why? For me, it was important because, I've been in human-computer interaction almost 30 years. It started being that half the questions I would get about accessibility were legal questions. And it's really unsatisfying to say to half of the questions, I don't know, that's a great question. You should ask someone else, right? So what I did is I took a leave of absence and I went back to earn an LLM degree from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. And I encourage all of you, there's an article in Interactions about my experience. Go take a gap year and learn another discipline to strengthen your passion and your knowledge in human-computer interaction, user experience, accessibility, however you define your work. But I'm very excited today to talk with you about the born accessible model. So let's first start by talking about digital accessibility and what does that mean, right? I think in concept many of us know, but there are different working definitions. So I'm going to give the working definition I'll use today, and that's that a person with a disability can secure the same information and engage in the same transactions as a person without a disability with a substantially equivalent ease of use. Now that's important because, imagine if, let's say you're blind and you're using a screen reader and a task takes you like 10 minutes. And imagine instead that you are someone without a disability and it only takes you 10 seconds. That's not equivalent ease of use. So we talk about all of the different things that if you have an inaccessible interface, it can lead to barriers for people with disabilities, right? So for instance, if you're blind and you want to apply for a job, you want to apply for a job online, or if you're deaf and you want to access content for your class, but the video is not captioned. So there are all these barriers that you could face until the technology is remediated. But the technology being remediated, why do we need to wait for the technology to be remediated? Why do we have to wait? Why does the technology need to be remediated? Why can't the technology start out as born accessible? And that's why we need the born accessible model of technology and content development. We need the born accessible model. Now, there's a great article that Jan mentioned in his opening keynote, right, talking about different definitions of inclusive design, design for all, universal access, right? And, in general, it's increasing the accessibility of the interactive system for the widest possible range of use by the largest number of people. But the question is often, how do we get there? Like, this is great, right? I think we're all in HCI. We can all agree upon this, right? We want the largest number of people to be able to use the technology, right? We're all in agreement. I mean, does anyone disagree? Right? I'm sorry, you disagree. Okay. So, but often the question is, how do we get there? Right? If we want to make something accessible, it's not enough just to say that we want it to be usable by the largest number of people. We have to figure out, how do we get there? Who do we include? What are the plans? How do we do this involvement? Now, there was a great article in Interactions Magazine, maybe 2017, by Elizabeth Churchill, putting accessibility first. And in the article, Elizabeth talked about how building inaccessible technology or content, right, and then remediating it is not an effective strategy. It doesn't make sense to do that, right? And one of the things Elizabeth talked about is if you build a technology and release it, and then people with disabilities need to wait until it's remediated, that doesn't make any sense. Now, I add on to that it's a form of discrimination. Why? If you have someone with a disability who doesn't have access, and people without disabilities have access, and so let's say for a year, you have some people who have access and some people who don't, and people with disabilities don't, that's a form of discrimination. So that delay, that lack of access, is a form of discrimination. So that's the first reason we need the born accessible model, right? If you build something and then certain people don't have access and they have to wait, that's a form of discrimination. Let's talk about the second one. Leaving accessibility fixes until later causes the perception that accessibility is expensive. How many people have heard before, oh, accessibility is expensive? How many people have heard that misnomer? Okay, great, many of you. Let the record reflect that many people have their hands up. Oh, sorry, that's the lawyer coming out. I'm not actually a practicing lawyer, but I've just studied law, so Helen gave me a little bit too much credit, but let the record reflect. So leaving accessibility fixes till later causes the perception that it's expensive. Now, how many people have heard this study before? This is the Osman study from 2008. Accessibility can double the amount of code. How many people have heard this before? A few people have. Okay.
Something like that.
Something like that. The challenge is that that's actually not true. It's retrofitting for accessibility that doubles the amount of code. It's not making it accessible that doubles the amount of code. It's retrofitting. So if you choose a bad strategy, right, and you decide, I'm going to add the accessibility later, I'm going to retrofit, that's your fault. Accessibility isn't inherently, think about it. If you build a house from scratch, you can make it accessible. It doesn't cost anything more. You make sure the door frames are wide enough. You make sure the bathroom has enough turnaround radius, right? But if you build a home, and then you have to go back and you have to change the door frames, and you have to reframe them, and you have to regrade the lot, and that could be expensive. So Elizabeth points out in her article, Elizabeth Churchill, when accessibility requirements are deferred, a backlog of accessibility debt is created, and downstream costs will likely be incurred. For example, you may design a complex workflow with intricate elements to complete a task. If you haven't considered accessibility up front, you may discover that some of the elements are impossible to build for accessibility, so then you have to redesign and rebuild the entire workflow from scratch, Elizabeth's words, and this will slow you far more than taking these requirements into account up front ever could. So it's the remediation that actually leads to the perception that accessibility is expensive. Okay, so what we have right now is a chart from Bias and Mayhew, Cost Justifying Usability, right? Classic HCI book, 1994. By show of hands, how many people have read at least portions of Cost Justifying Usability? Yeah, okay, that makes, so let the record show it's about 2/3 of the people in the auditorium. Well, no, but it's important, there are people on Zoom, they can't tell how many hands are being held. It's an inclusive design feature, come on, right? So, in this chart here, it shows that at the beginning of design, the number of possible alternatives, design alternatives, is high, and the cost of making changes is low. As you go from requirements to development to deployment, the cost of changes goes up and you have fewer design choices, right? So the cost of changes goes up at the end. The cost of changes is very low at the beginning. If you look at double diamond model of design, you can see similar concepts. If you look at this idea of shift left, where you shift the effort and shift the testing left to earlier in development, right? You'll see the same thing, right? So you test earlier, you put more effort in earlier, it's actually lower costs. Remediating after the fact is never the most innovative or elegant design solution. So that's the third point. So the first point, again, we talked about how people with disabilities may face a delay. The second point we talked about is that not only the delay, but that if you remediate, it may be expensive. But the third part is that remediation after the fact is not the most innovative or elegant design solution. So what we have on the left is an example of a remediated ramp, right? This is a remediation, right? You have steps. There were 2 tracks put up. There's someone using a wheelchair going down. It's not legal. The slope is it's too much of a slope. It looks kind of ugly. It's not safe. This is not what we want. Now you compare that remediation to something like this, right? This building on the right was accessibility built from the start. Look how elegant that looks. Look how futuristic that looks. Now, so I have to tell you, these were the 2 images I'd planned to use for the presentation. But I kept stumbling upon things last week when I was in London. So I've got some, and in Cambridge. So I've got some on-the-ground examples that I spotted while I was traveling last week. Okay, so what you see on the left is a dining table. You're nodding your head. You want to guess where it is? Go for it.
It enables a wheelchair to get to the table.
Right. So this is actually in Churchill College, no relation to Elizabeth Churchill, right? Churchill College in Cambridge, and this is in their dining hall. And so what you have here is that they have the long table, as you have in many traditional halls at Cambridge and Oxford, right? And it's added on to the end. Now notice it's a different type of wood. Notice it's worn out. It's clearly bolted on. It's worn out. It's inelegant. You look at it, it's kind of ugly, right? And not only that, from a functionality point of view, think about it. If you are using a wheelchair, you can only sit on the end because the rest of the table, there's not enough clearance room underneath, right? So if you think about if you sit at a table, right? Normally you could talk with the person across from you, on each side of you, kind of catty-cornered. You have maybe 4 or 5 communication partners. If you're using a wheelchair with this retrofitted thing, all you have is the 2 people right next to you. You don't have a choice for where you sit. So this is my first example I spotted in Cambridge. So this is a retrofitted example. Now, let's look at a born accessible example. On the right, there is this elegant entryway. Does anyone want to guess where this is?
Royal College of Arts in London.
Not too far away. You're close. Victoria and Albert Museum. Who said that? Victoria and Albert. Ding, ding, ding. Or Ani Ruda gets a prize. Right? Victoria and Albert Museum. This is the new entrance on Exhibition Road. And notice that if you go left, there's the steps. If you go right, you have the ramp. Right? It's elegant. It didn't cost any more, right? It's just a great born accessible solution. So we've got these 3 reasons why you want to do born accessible rather than remediation, right? And also, I want to talk about a few other things related to this. First of all, we're talking about the users now. But imagine that you procure or develop a technology now that is inaccessible. That also serves as a barrier in the future. So there's an example from the US Department of Labor. There was a series of, about 10 years ago, there's a series of Freedom of Information Act requests. And these requests related to trying to determine how US federal agencies were complying with Section 508 of the Rehab Act. And that's a US statute that requires that federal technology be accessible for people with disabilities, right? So it applies to both like public technology like websites and also technologies for federal employees. And the FOIA request, the Freedom of Information Act request, discovered that the US Department of Labor asked for permission to procure inaccessible technology. Why? They said, believe it or not, they said, well, we don't have any people with disabilities who might use this software now. So we should be able to procure inaccessible software. Of course, if you procure inaccessible software because you say we don't have people with disabilities, That's a barrier to hiring people with disabilities in the future, right? So you've then created future barriers. Now, in summary, the reason we want to use the born accessible approach, and I'll talk shortly about how we do it, in summary, we want to do it because, first of all, it ensures that people with disabilities have access at the same time. Second of all, it lowers accessibility costs. And third of all, it drives innovation. It's good design. It's good innovation. But we're talking about building technology. We're talking about, digital content. What about our education? Let me ask, how many people in the room, how many people, by show of hands, teach content about accessibility in courses that you teach? By show of hands. OK. So about half to 2/3, let the record show. And so, right, how many of you teach it at the beginning of an academic program? By show of hands.
What do you mean by the beginning?
When in students' first few classes. At the beginning, not of a semester, but at the beginning of the program. OK, let the record show there's only a few hands up here. Most places, and there's research, Putnam et al. In ACM Transactions on Accessible Computing, did research on this and found that, that actually most universities teach accessibility at the end of an academic program. You've learned how to code, you've learned operating systems, you've learned all these other things. Right? And then right before you graduate, you learn accessibility. Well, what are you going to think? You're going to think accessibility comes at the end. Right? That's not a good model. And there are few academic programs that teach accessibility all throughout. I want to mention that the University of Dundee in Scotland is a notable program that does that, where they teach accessibility like in modules in every course. Right? So we don't want to teach accessibility at the end of an academic program. We want to teach it throughout an academic program, starting at the beginning, using like a born accessible approach. So our goal should be that we want the world to move to the born accessible model for any technologies and content being built from here on out. Okay, is everyone with me on that, first of all? Is everyone with me? From here on out, we want all technologies, all digital content that's built to be accessible. So imagine that somehow the power and the energy of Interact and all the people we've met, somehow imagine September 1st to 2023, imagine we're able to actually make that happen. Okay? Let's say we're able to do it. All right. Even if somehow, miraculously, we're able to do that, we would still have billions and trillions of technologies and content that need to be remediated. So even if we are able to make everything accessible going forward, we still need lots of research on remediation. PDF documents, right? Everyone knows they're hard to make accessible, right? There are probably 3 trillion PDF documents right now in the world. Almost all of them are inaccessible. So I do collaborative research with Adobe Research on how they can make it easier to remediate PDF documents. Even if everything going forward was accessible, we still need research on how to make the 3 trillion existing PDF documents accessible. So I'm calling for everything being built going forward to be accessible, but I want to acknowledge we still need research on remediation for accessibility. And I want to give my 2 colleagues here at the University of Maryland, or 2 of my colleagues, so as Helen mentioned, I'm executive director of the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility. We have over 40 faculty and staff, right, and many graduate students across 7 colleges, many disciplines, all of whom are passionate about digital accessibility. Now, Baron Jordan and Huashu Peng are 2 of my colleagues in MIDA, as we call it. Baron Jordan works on technology guidelines and devices to make accessible, right, self-service ticket machines and kiosks. So if you want to build a kiosk, you want to know how to make it accessible, how do you make the touchscreen, the software, the device, the hardware, the input device, how do you make all of it accessible? Right, Baron would work with you. But even if every single kiosk going forward is accessible, you have millions of inaccessible kiosks and self-service ticket machines now. And so you need Huashu Peng and his students who are coming up with solutions for when a blind person, right, suddenly encounters an inaccessible kiosk machine. It doesn't help to call Baron and say, hey, Baron, can you build a new one? Right? Someone needs a solution at that moment. And Huashu and his students have actually built a technology, right, smartphone app and a few other things they've put together so that if you're blind, you encounter an inaccessible kiosk, you can use suction cups, attach them to the touchscreen, interact with the inaccessible touchscreen through your phone, and interact that way. So we need both types of research to really make the world accessible. So what does the born accessible model involve? What does it involve? Now, this is interesting because I think most people have heard of the ideas of born accessible, right? Show of hands, who has at least heard about born accessible? Okay, so about a third, let the record show about a third of people here. What's interesting is there isn't a well-accepted, well-agreed-upon definition, and there's relatively little research. Yet people are always saying, make it born accessible. But to do so, we need to know how to do that. So what does the born accessible model involve? So I spent a lot of time talking with disability rights groups. At MIDA, at the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility, we have 12 disability rights groups on our advisory board, right? And I reached out to all of them and said, here's what I've read. You know, kind of what do you think it's missing, right? What do you think? You know, and they helped me tweak it a little bit. So based on what's been published so far, based on talks with 12 different disability rights groups, based on all of these different experiences, what does the born accessible model include? It includes these 4 items. First, set clear accessibility goals from the start of a project. We'll talk about each one of these in detail, obviously, right? Second of all, include people with disabilities from the start of the design process. Third, code to accessibility standards. And 4, involve people with disabilities in user evaluations. Yeah, by all means, you're welcome to take a picture of it. I should also mention this is being video recorded, so there will be a video going online at some point. So let's talk about each one of these 4 core concepts of the born accessible model. First of all, set clear accessibility goals from the start of a project. Clear accessibility goals. Let's talk about different types of projects, first of all. I mean, right, many of us are researchers, many of us are developers, many of us are academics. There are all these different types of projects. First of all, let's separate out assistive technologies. Assistive technologies, which are technologies that are built specifically to allow someone with a disability to have better access, input or output. So, assistive technologies, things like screen readers, alternative keyboards, alternative pointing devices. There are all sorts of different types of alternate input and output. And you know, if you're building an assistive technology, you're likely to actually include people with disabilities from the start, right? You're not going to build a screen reader that doesn't involve blind people in the process, and you know, it just wouldn't make sense. So for assistive technology, it's pretty common to include people with disabilities from the start. But once you get to general purpose technologies, it's very hard to find cases of building, you know, a standard operating system, software app, phone, device, website, where they focus on born accessible design. And that's much less common. And it's also important to understand that the approaches for how you do born accessible design and kind of your methods will differ depending on whether or not you are building the technology in-house or whether you are contracting out to someone else, right? Because actually, if you're contracting out to someone else, if you're using a vendor, there's a whole bunch of legal techniques you can do. See, and this is why I love the tie-in with law and HCI. There are moments where the tool you need is not software. There are moments the tool you need is some good language in a contract. So what are some methods that you can use for this first aspect of the born accessible method? First of all, cross-train all members of the development team on accessibility. Right? Everyone should have awareness of it. Second of all, only use tools. Any tools that you are going to use in your development, make sure that they have the ability to create accessible code, accessible content, whatever. Make sure they are tools that will help you. People often say, well, yeah, you know, the tools we have are accessible. Well, do they generate accessible code or content? No. Well, they're accessible for someone to use, but they won't actually help you build accessible things. That's problematic. Also, always identify the market opportunity of people with disabilities. People with disabilities are a market opportunity. Now, what you have here is a graphic of the University of Maryland stadium. And what you have is the bottom crescent. You have about a quarter of the people, 26% of people, are highlighted in red who have a disability. And that's in the US and many other developed countries. That's about average. Depending on the country, it's about 20%, 25%, 30%. Right? So about 26% of people in the US have a disability. But yet we have so much research that documents that people without disabilities also benefit from accessibility, from accessible features, right? So there's the Microsoft and Forrester research study about a majority of people without disabilities actually benefit from accessibility features. There's the Schmutz et al. 2016 that documented how compliance with WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, actually, right, helps people without disabilities. So right now you see many more people highlighted. A majority of people with and without disabilities will be helped by accessibility features, by compliance with technical standards, by born accessible design. It actually helps everyone. It helps everyone. So if you are developing technology in-house from the start, right, make sure that accessibility is a required stated design goal. Make sure you use checklists. Make sure you have scenarios and personas that involve people with disabilities. Now, here's where it gets into, I can like put my law hat on, right? If you are contracting, if you are hiring a vendor to either purchase technology or to build technology, this is where you need to think about contract law. Because you want to have in the contract that it's in the contract that what they're delivering to you must be accessible. It's part of the contractual terms. Many universities and government agencies have procurement approaches. They use procurement approaches, right? And for the procurement approaches, what they do is in the contract it states it must be accessible. Procurement approaches basically are ways to check to make sure that money is being spent properly. You know, every time I've testified to our legislature, their state legislature in Maryland, I always talk about I don't want my tax dollars being used to procure inaccessible software that discriminates against people with disabilities. I frame it as my tax dollars, I don't want that money being used to discriminate. Now, here's another technique you can use. If you are procuring technology, you can use what's known as an indemnification clause. Now you might say, oh no, there it goes with the law. Indemnification clause, what does that mean? That means in a contract, if you're purchasing a technology from the vendor, an indemnification clause will indemnify the purchaser in case, you know, let's say it's your university. Your university gets sued, right? Because what they procured was inaccessible technology. The vendor indemnifies the university so that if there's a lawsuit, the vendor is on the hook, right? By the way, these are things you can put in contracts. So this is very popular in the US, the indemnification clause. If a vendor says, wait, I can't indemnify you, I don't want to be on the hook, ask them why. Why not? Is it really accessible? Right? Things like VPATs. How many people have heard of the VPAT, the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template? By show of hands? Okay, let the record show I think there's about 5 people. Right? A VPAT is a document where technology vendors discuss the accessibility of their products. They're not always honest, so take it with a grain of salt. But something that's very important, and I want to encourage all of you to do, is anytime you as a computer scientist, computer engineer, HCI developer, user experience, whatever your title is, right? Anytime you talk about legal requirements, please be specific about the law. Don't say the law requires or there is a law. The worst thing to say is there is a law. Really, well, what is that law? Be very specific. Be very specific up front to clearly define your legal requirements. What laws, what statutes? Is it, right, the Equality Act in the UK? Is it the Stanca Act in Italy? Is it, you know, the Americans with Disabilities Act in the US? Be very specific about what the law is, the statute, the regulation, or if you're in a common law country, the case law, that applies. Now, the company that's probably best known for a born accessible model is Apple. And I'm going to give some quotes here from Sarah Herlinger, who is the Director of Digital Accessibility at Apple. Now, she said, accessibility is something that's brought in at the very early stages of everything that we do. The accessibility teams, they're working with every design team on every new product to say, okay, we're going to come out with this new whatever it might be, and how do we ensure that this product will work for everyone? So it's a really early and often way that we get there and we talk to all the different teams and make sure that they're thinking about accessibility from day one, right? So Apple's approach is you start talking about accessibility, right? The accessibility teams meet with the design teams and make sure it's not just the accessibility teams working on it, it's the design teams who are working on it. You think about accessibility from the start. So how many people have heard about Quorum, the accessible programming language? Show of hands if you've heard of Quorum. I think we have 1 hand, thank you. Yes, you get a free water bottle. Oh, sorry, two. We have 2 hands, right? You got a free water bottle, courtesy of Helen. So Quorum is a fully accessible programming language, right? Do we still have water bottles left? Pens? Water bottles, pens, whatever's at the registration desk, you get as a prize. So how do we make programming accessible by everyone? Andy Steffet created the Quorum programming language, told me that's where he started. How do we make programming accessible to everyone? He said we started by observing high school age blind individuals using programming languages. So they did some user research even to figure out where some of the barriers might be. But our first goal was, how do we make programming accessible to everyone? For so many reasons. Right? If your programming language is inaccessible, that would cut people out of a lot of careers in technology. That would cut you out of a lot of potential academic programs. Now Slack, I know a lot of people in the conference were using Slack. Slack recently did a redesign, and they said publicly, we took accessibility very seriously throughout the development process, and we tried to bake it into the fundamental way we are working from a design perspective, ensuring that the product was as accessible as we could possibly make. They said what's exciting is that we don't just work on accessibility for accessibility features, quote unquote. This is something that's becoming part of our standard practice for even the most fundamental and large-scale projects. We are baking accessibility into our process and the way that we fundamentally work. So you see Slack, you see Quorum, you see Apple. They are starting talking about accessibility at the beginning. They're starting at the beginning with accessibility as a goal. So that's the first part of the current iteration of the Born Accessible model. Let's talk about the second part, including people with disabilities from the start of the design process. And let me ask, how many people were at the panel discussion at the beginning of Interact, all about ethics, where we talked about including people with disabilities and their goals? How many people were at that panel? Show of hands. Okay, the records show about a third of the attendees. The mantra you often hear from the disability rights community is, nothing about us without us. Right? And this is what, again, Sarah Herlinger from Apple started talking about. She said on a podcast, we've always incorporated members of the community into the process as we've done this. We believe in the mantra of the disability community of nothing about us without us. Because you can't design a product that's really going to work for someone if you're on the outside looking in and you think you know how something's going to work. Philosophically, the Born Accessible model is within our HCI traditions. Okay, by show of hands, who is familiar with user-centered design? Come on, right there, everyone should be. Who is familiar with participatory design? Got it, most people should be. How about value-sensitive design? Right? These are things we know deep down. These are things, let the record show, pretty much all the hands were up. Right? These are things we know. These are things that are part of our tradition for the last 30, 40 years. So this idea of bringing users in early on and focusing on their needs and their tasks, we know how to do this. This is us. Wait, isn't that a TV show, This Is Us? Anyway, we know how to do this. But often people don't think about accessibility because they make a mistake. They think that people with disabilities are not our users. Often developers, designers, technologists, they fail to understand that people with disabilities are always your users. Right? And so if you think that if you understand that people with disabilities are always your users, then it leads to you saying, oh, I think I can do this. UCD, PD, VSD, we know how to do this, right? This is part of our tradition. So what are some methods you can use for this aspect? First of all, hiring people with disabilities as developers. This is really important. It's great to have people involved in participatory design, but actually people with disabilities make fantastic developers, designers, right? And Richard Ladner, who's a well-known professor from University of Washington, would often say this. People with disabilities are naturally problem solvers and creative. They do it every day. They face barriers every single day, and they're used to looking for workarounds. It's not just Richard saying this. I did a research study in 2007. Many of you may have read about the frustrations of 100 blind users, as they're interacting with screen readers on the web. And I see a few nods. Good. It's always good to know when people have read your work, right? And so in that study, we actually found that blind users were more effective than in other studies, people without disabilities, in responding to errors and frustrations. Why? The blind users didn't give up. They didn't just say, I'm going to hit reboot. They said, okay, well, I've got a few different strategies. Let me try it. Let me see what works. So first of all, hire people with disabilities as developers, right, at whatever the university, company, research lab. Second of all, participatory design, have people with disabilities as co-designers. That makes a lot of sense. right? I think, again, everyone's familiar with PD. User advisory boards. So if you can't involve people in a co-design, maybe there whatever barriers you face there, user advisory boards are actually a way that a number of organizations have been handling this. So Google, for instance, they have a program called Trusted Tester where they have a panel of users with disabilities. I should mention, Trusted Tester actually is a phrase that means something completely different in the US government. So Trusted Tester in the US government is actually a certification program for learning about technical standards. But many government agencies in multiple countries have boards of people with disabilities who are their employees, who, let's say, give feedback on a bi-weekly basis about technology. And you can use all of these approaches. You can have people with disabilities as developers. You can have them as co-designers. You can have user advisory boards. I suggest also work with disability rights organizational advisory boards. Put together an advisory board of the major disability rights groups in your country, in your jurisdiction, there you go, right? In your jurisdiction, find the disability rights groups, find the advocates, involve them. Now, when it comes to involving people with disabilities as co-designers in technology development, it's actually not that hard. Remember I said find examples when you're building assistive technology. 2 recent examples from, I believe both are Assets conference this year. One is for people with dyslexia as co-designers from Google. They're building a writing prototype to write for people with dyslexia. It's called Lamppost. That's from Assets. You should be able to easily find that. Find My Things, is a paper from Microsoft. Again, they had blind and low vision users as co-designers on the design team to help people who are blind find items. But again, these are really designed for these populations. So you want to think more broadly about how to do this. You want to think more broadly about different types of apps and software and operating systems and hardware devices. And how do we get this born accessible model? How do you get people with disabilities involved from the start? Now, what's interesting to me is that if you go do a web search on born accessible, let me ask, how many people already in the middle of the talk have searched on born accessible? I'm curious. By show of hands, who searched? Okay, that's great. Okay, 5 or 6 people, that's good, right? So if you search on born accessible, most of what you will find on the web is about born accessible books. You'll mostly find about ebooks that were born accessible, right? And so the screenshot I have here is an example from Bookshare, and Benetech. And how many people have heard of Bookshare? One of the largest digital repositories of accessible ebooks. How many people have heard of Bookshare? Okay, check out Bookshare. How many people have heard of the Marrakesh Treaty, which is the treaty that allows for cross-border flows of accessible books? Marrakesh Treaty, okay. I'm giving you some things you can make sure to learn about. Thank you. Let the record show we have about 5 people who know. But what's interesting about ebooks, the publishers say we want to be born accessible, which is good. By the way, I want to right now make a plea to everyone in here. How many people here have written books or plan on writing books or editing books? Show of hands. Okay, let the record show it's about half. Oh my God, Helen, you have a fantastic audience. This is, oh my gosh. So about half of you, anytime you sign a book contract, whether it's authored, edited, whatever, make sure there's a line in your contract saying that the book will be made available in an accessible electronic format using accessible EPUB 3 at the same time as the paper edition. Please do. That's a way you can help educate publishers. You can push publishers on this. Now, we want to make sure that books are born accessible because remember, if it's a book, you first of all create the book probably on your laptop or your desktop, right? It starts right, as text, right? And the book, once the book is created, they don't often go back and change the book. So once you create an ebook, right, if it's not accessible, they rarely go back and change it. So you want to demand that books are created in an accessible format. Now, you typically don't interact with the book. You interact with the book reader, right? But the book itself doesn't have much interaction. It's pretty static. You're just reading, right? So it's sort of like the difference between a PDF document of like a research article. If you read research articles, from Assets or something, you read the article, but you don't really have much interaction per se with the PDF document. Now think about PDF forms. A PDF form, you interact with, you tab from field to field, you type in things, right? So when you see born accessible, you often see it in the context of books. But books aren't redesigned. Books aren't, so we want to push this more into the realm of interactive technologies. apps, software, operating systems, websites. So that was the second part of the Born Accessible model. The third part is coding to accessibility standards. Now let me just start by show of hands. How many people have at least heard of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG? Okay, let the record show it's nearly everyone. How many people consider themselves pretty familiar with WCAG? Okay, about a third. That's great. So the technical standards that you want to know about are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, EPUB 3, which I mentioned. Accessible EPUB 3 is a technical standard for ebooks. How many people before the presentation had heard of EPUB 3? By show of hands. Okay, about half. Great. How about PDF UA? How many people have heard of the PDF UA standard? Okay, so maybe about 10, 15 or so. 16, got it. One person put up the hand at the end. Okay, so the PDF UA standard, PDF Universal Access, it's a technical standard for making accessible PDF documents. We need to acknowledge that at this point it is harder to make a PDF document accessible than it is other formats. Adobe is working on this. I'm collaborating with Adobe to try to make this happen. But what you can do, by the way, is certainly always demand this and push for this and say, this is one of the pain points, acknowledge this is one of the pain points for our community and let people know. How many people have heard of WCAG 2 ICT? Out of curiosity, show of hands if you've heard of WCAG 2 ICT. Okay, very few people. So WCAG, of course, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, is the best known set of technical standards in the world for accessibility. But of course, WCAG, it's web content. What if you say, well, everyone knows WCAG? What WCAG 2 ICT does is it helps you apply the concepts of WCAG to non-web technologies. It's just a guidance document that helps use that because everyone knows WCAG. Fewer people know EPUB 3, fewer people know PDF UA. So WCAG helps you, and there aren't technical guidelines for every type of technology or app or content, and I don't know that we would want that many different technical standards, right? The strength of a technical standard is it's a standard. There's one, and you have a lot of people who know it. So get to know your standards. But I would be remiss, given that we're at the University of York, if I did not mention one of the seminal papers about WCAG and accessibility. And it's a paper by Helen and by Andre and David and Chris. And this is a paper out of the University of York from 2012 called Guidelines Are Only Half the Story. Accessibility Problems Encountered by Blind Users on the Web. And Helen and her great colleagues at the University of York found that only 50.4% of the problems encountered by users were covered by success criteria in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Right? And so what they found is that, just compliance with guidelines doesn't mean it's going to be accessible. It doesn't mean people will be able to use it. If you include accessibility, the idea that people will be able to effectively use something, right? There are a lot of people, if a website meets technical standards, that doesn't mean that they'll actually be able to use it. And many governments, wait, you're still taking a picture. Here, I'll move the slide back. You got the picture? Okay, good. Do you want me to stand and you can take a picture with me with the paper in front of me? No? Huh? Yeah, there you go. No?
Not that 0.4%. It's very specific.
That's right. So many governments actually take this approach, where they say that accessibility means compliance with technical standards. What better place than the University of York could we be to be saying, well, actually, that's not true. Right? It's not true that just accessibility means compliance with technical standards. But many governments around the world, in the US, it's certain types of technologies where they say compliance with technical standards means you've met the law. So I want to give a little bit about the methods for compliance with technical standards. Obviously, if you're doing any type of coding or markup, use the technical standards. If you are using tools to either create content or code, right, make sure that you use tools that can create accessible content and code, and make sure that you have enabled all the accessibility features. A lot of tools have accessibility features, right? But you actually don't, they don't appear unless you go ahead and actually enable all of them. And by the way, I would say go further. Make them requirements. Make it, if you have 1,000 people at your university who generate web content, what I would do is say, make sure that when they generate web content, that you actually, right, have it so they cannot post content that fails the accessibility checks. So evaluate for compliance to standards using manual inspections rather than automated tools. Now, how many people here are familiar with automated tools for checking, for instance, for web accessibility? How many people use an automated tool? Okay, so about a third of the people here. Let me ask, when you use an automated tool, do you find a lot of false positives? Things that say, yes. Or like, it'll say, this web page has 25 accessibility flaws, 320 potential accessibility flaws. Yeah, I see a few hands on that, nods of heads. The tools often have a lot of false positives. So if you use automated tools, you're actually likely, it's going to be a little bit worse, right? It's going to be likely a little bit worse, right, than it is in reality. So people then say, oh, well, accessibility is hard. Look, the tool tells me there's 250 flaws. There isn't 250 flaws, right? So evaluate for compliance to technical standards using manual inspections, not automated tools. And when possible, use accessible page templates. Now, this is actually something we did research on. I have an image here from a study we did about 10 years ago in Government Information Quarterly, right? The state agencies in our state that used accessible page templates wound up having much more accessible content, right? It makes sense, right? If you give people something that has guidance, it's actually an easy way to lead to more accessible content. The fourth aspect of the Born Accessible model is to involve people with disabilities in user evaluations. Now, let's just start off by saying, you might be thinking, but I have people with disabilities on my design team. But you can't just have the people who developed the technology evaluate it. They're probably going to have much more technology experience. They're going to be, much more advanced as a user. And so you need to have different people with disabilities, and you need to have a larger circle of people, different people, a larger circle of people, right? More people with disabilities, people with different types of disabilities than you have in the actual development. So have very clear inclusion criteria. How many populations of users are you involving? Are you looking at like different, even things like if, let's say, you're going to have 6 blind users. Do you want to have 2 blind users who use the voiceover screen reader, 2 who use, JAWS, right? For people who are deaf or hard of hearing, do you want to have some who use sign language, right? Some who use, you can imagine. Be specific as to what categories and what the inclusion criteria are. Often, as people in HCI, UX, and accessibility, we can't ask about your visual acuity. We can't ask you a medical question. So instead, what you do is ask them about what types of technologies they use. If you want to know if someone has residual vision, don't ask them if, well, what's your visual acuity? Do you have residual vision? Ask, are you able to use screen magnification? If they can't use screen magnification, it's likely they don't have much residual vision. Ask about the technologies that they can use and how they use them instead of about anything medical. So, distributed research, whenever possible. You can get access to more people with disabilities if you can do the research remotely, right? Obviously, the pandemic accelerated this change. We all consider this much more valid than we used to. So find ways to remotely include people with disabilities in your evaluations. And here's a really important question. When it comes to doing user evaluations, you always have to ask, what are we aiming for? Do we want our users to use a consistent set of technology, right? A specific laptop, all the users of a certain disability category will have the same assistive technology with the same settings. I actually lean towards doing evaluations with users' own technology. Why? They have their technology specifically set up to have the best user experience for them. So the best user experience for them is with their assistive technology, with their settings, maximized. It will show them at their best. And that's really important. As experimental design people, we sometimes say, well, we want to have consistency. But you know what? If you have people evaluate a technology using someone else's assistive technology, you're going to be open to claims that, well, it's not really that bad. Right? You often hear that with accessibility. Well, it's not really that bad. Well, actually, if they're using the best case scenario, they're using their own technology setup, it really is that bad then. Right? It really is that this is showing them at their best, and we want to show users at their best. So when it comes to user evaluations, help the users, if they do need to come in person, help the users figure out transportation, make sure that the building that they're coming to is accessible for them. Do not make last-minute changes. Why? Yes. Oh, yep, got it. Do not make last-minute changes. And so what you want to also think about is what modifications would you be willing to make? So for instance, if you're doing user evaluations involving people with cognitive impairment, consider a little bit more flexibility. And I'll give you 3 examples. We've had studies where people with autism, right, they need some more breaks in between. That's totally fine. People with different types of cognitive impairments, for instance, we did an evaluation study involving people with Down syndrome. And we were doing a calendaring task. And we were asking them, add to the calendar on Saturday, right, from 1 to 2 p.m., Steve's birthday party. And we had a user who said, I'm not willing to do that. Why not? You have a birthday party that lasts only 1 hour? Right? I'm not willing to do this task unless you make it 3 hours. Steve deserves a proper birthday party. I'm like, okay, from our task point of view, it doesn't make a difference. We wouldn't have thought of that. So we just said, fine, put it in for 3 hours. It doesn't make a difference in how we evaluate the technology. And some people with cognitive impairment struggle with the idea of test accounts. They feel that they might be using someone else's account. Why are you giving me someone else's account? So think about what you might do to help with that, about allowing them to use their own accounts. Changing the format of the communication. You may need to have a sign language interpreter. You may need to have printouts in Braille. Right? Just adjust to whatever is needed. And realize that for some people, for instance, if you must have a signature, it may be that you need to have a signature guide to help them where they sign. It may be that, like, instead of a Likert scale for some people with cognitive impairment, having sort of like you see in the airport loo, where you have, right, a smiley face to a frowny face, that's a Likert scale, right? You can do that. And examples of user evaluations from Rochelle Gold, who gave one of the keynotes, she told me that every 2 weeks in the NHS, right, they do user evaluations, and their goal is that 1 out of every 6 users who test whatever technology they're working on has a diverse need. And I said, that's great. Is that just the NHS? And she said, no, that's actually part of the gov.uk service standards, that service teams should carry out research with participants who represent the potential audience for the service, including people with access needs. So I'm thrilled they're not just saying code to standards. So that's the summary of the Born Accessible model. Set clear accessibility goals from the start of a project, include people with disabilities from the start of a design process, code to accessibility standards, and involve people with disabilities in user evaluations. Now, I want to ask all of you, contribute to this. What are the next steps? What can we all do together to move forward these ideas? Well, as I mentioned, there actually isn't out there in the literature, there's not much about the Born Accessible model. Think about how much you've read about participatory design, about user-centered design. You haven't read that much about the Born Accessible model. So I have some ideas for what are some next steps. There isn't even full agreement yet between even disability rights groups about what the Born Accessible model means. So we need to work with various stakeholders, disability rights groups, right, across the world, international organizations, NGOs, governments. Next steps, gain agreement on a definition of and the methods for the Born Accessible model. We need a lot of work on this. We need to have stakeholders in multiple locations together to come up with an agreed upon definition. Second of all, collect data on the benefits and costs of the Born Accessible model. Now, we often talk about this. Make it born accessible. It's less expensive. It's more elegant. How much less expensive is it? That's really important if you want to get into policy. If you want to get into policy and law requirements for the Born Accessible model, you have to demonstrate the cost savings, right? Most governments have some type of cost-benefit analysis for activities and policies. We need data on how much less expensive it is. How much money do you save? Right now it's just, we know it's cheaper. How much cheaper? We don't know. So we need that type of data. We need HCI work about what are the best methods, activities, and tools to have the most effective Born Accessible model. What types of collection activities? How many users is optimal? What different types of disabilities do we need represented? For instance, since there are certain kind of crossover effects of accessibility, right? So for instance, blind people need to have technologies, right? Need to have applications, software, websites that are keyboard friendly. Well, people with motor impairments also need things that are keyboard friendly because their setup for an assistive technology requires keyboard friendly, that you not be required to use a pointing device. So kind of where are those overlaps? What do we need to strive for here? What are the user involvement activities, right? What are the approaches? What software tools do we need? Do we need requirements gathering tools? There's very little we know, and this is the step that in the HCI community we specialize in, right? We specialize in methods, activities, and tools. Again, there are thousands of articles about PD, UCD. Let's make it thousands of articles about the born accessible model. Now, we know very little so far about how to teach using a born accessible model. We need the community to, and we need all of you, to develop educational materials for teaching about the born accessible model. Yes, I heard a yes. Oh my gosh, this is great. Right? This is good. You want a response. And we also need to have research on the relationship between accessibility and usability. So kind of taking along with Helen and her colleagues in their work about, okay, so how much do we need past the standards? Are there certain standards that maybe aren't as valuable, right? Are there more activities we need? Do standards need to be changed to identify some other things? What is that relationship? It's unclear what that relationship is between maybe compliance with standards, accessibility. Even if you go to the Web Accessibility Initiative, they have a page all about accessible usability and usable accessibility, and we need a lot more work on how to make sense of that. So those are the steps I ask of the community. We can do this together. We can make the Born Accessible model happen. Again, I'm Jonathan Lazar. I'm a professor at the University of Maryland. I'm executive director of the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility. I am thrilled to be back at Interact in this wonderful, kind, welcoming community. I want you to remember the current version of the Born Accessible model: set clear accessibility goals from the start of a project, include people with disabilities from the start of the design process, code to accessibility standards, and involve people with disabilities in user evaluations. Together, we can make this happen. We can make the world we can make the world more inclusive. We can make the world more born accessible. We're going to do it together. I look forward to making some good trouble in the world with all of you. Thank you so much.